Thank you so much. This is such a great crowd. If I can make a pun, the joint is really hopping. Thank you. I am Clare Elliott. I am the author of Artists We've Known, selected works from the Walter Hopps and Caroline Huber collection. Thank you all for joining us for our program this evening, a conversation with artists Mel Chin and Terrell James and graphic designer Don Quaintance. Tonight we will discuss their participation in Artists We've Known and more generally explore the 1980s art scene and their engagement with Walter Hopps and Caroline Huber during those years and beyond. Tonight's program has been organized in conjunction with the curatorial imagination of Walter Hopps on view through August 13th. I hope that most of you have seen it, but you have plenty of chances to see it again or for the first time. That exhibition explores the influential curatorial vision of Walter Hopps and features more than 130 works by 70 artists, many of which are recent or promised gifts to the museum from Caroline Huber. And I could pause for a moment and remind you all to silence your cell phones. Walter and Caroline's wide-ranging collection of 20th century art is the focus of the book, which is filled with stories and reminiscences of Hopps's and Huber's adventures in more than 5 decades of American art. Copies of this publication are available at the Menil bookstore, which will remain open after our program concludes this evening. And I hope if you haven't visited there tonight, you will after we're done here. I'd like to begin by thanking each of our guest speakers for taking time out of their very busy schedules to be here with us this evening. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Tony Martinez in our programming department, who always does so much work for these programs, as well as to our new director of public programming, Mary Maximin. We're thrilled that Caroline is with us tonight and able to join in on the conversation. We have one more program in conjunction with this exhibition. On August 12th, in partnership with Aurora Picture Show, we will present Documents, Dreams, and Discards. The program will feature rarely seen short films relating to the artists and sensibilities that sparked Walter Hopps's formative years as a curator. The selection will include works by Joseph Cornell, Wallace Berman, Bruce Conner, and Storm DeHirsch, among others. The screening is planned for outdoors on the museum's front lawn. In the case of rain, the screening will be moved into the museum foyer, where we all are this evening. Also upcoming on Thursday, August 24th, in conjunction with the exhibition Grey Foy, Hyperreal, curator Robert Cozzolino will present The World Around Grey Foy. The lecture will examine Foy's imaginative, meticulous meditations on nature and explore the many ways the artist observed and changed the world around him. As always, Menil programs are free and open to everyone. So our conversation tonight will last about 45 minutes. Time permitting, we will take some questions from the audience, so please hold your questions until the microphone reaches you. The program is being recorded and will be available on demand for viewing on the Menil's YouTube page. And the program is also being live streamed, thanks to our social media team on Instagram. And I'll say now a few words of introduction about our participants. Mel Chin was born in Houston to Chinese parents in 1951 and raised in the city's legendary Fifth Ward neighborhood. He began making art at an early age, completing a Bachelor's of Art from Vanderbilt University. Both analytical and poetic, Chin's expansive body of work evades easy classification, incorporating aspects of alchemy, botany, and ecology, among other disciplines. Chin is well regarded for his collaborative approaches, inserting art into unexpected places and engaging with communities to provoke greater social awareness. In 2019, Chin was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant, and in 2021, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A 7th-generation Texan, Terrell James completed a BA from Sewanee University. She produces abstract interpretations of landscapes in a range of media and in scales both intimate and large. For more than 40 years, she has sought novel environments from which to paint, responding to the specificity of light, color, and history of each locale. James has taught at the Glassell School of Art and at Rice University in Houston. and has served as arts editor for several editions of the Gulf Coast Journal of Art and Literature. In 2016, James was awarded Texas Artist of the Year by the Art League of Houston. Don Quaintance is a graphic designer and author who worked with Dominique de Menil and Walter Hopps to create the graphic identity for the inauguration of the Menil collection in 1987. Quaintance then designed most of the museum's printed ephemera for the following 3 decades and numerous Menil exhibition catalogs, including Hopps's groundbreaking Robert Rauschenberg, The Early 1950s in 1991, and a book about the museum's history, art, and activism, Projects of John and Dominique de Menil in 2010. Working with Caroline Huber at Houston's Diverse Works, he designed the organization's ephemera for several years and its 10th anniversary catalog in 1993. He's the author of Gray Foy Drawings, 1941 to 1975, and the forthcoming book about Hopps's most renowned curatorial achievement, titled Marcel Duchamp in Pasadena, Anatomy of a Retrospective. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. So Don is going to start us off with a reading about the Bardol Man.
So first off, I wanted to make sure everybody realizes this is really special because the 3 people sitting up here are all native Houstonians.
Very rare.
So you actually can make it in the art world if you stay here. Mel's kind of flown the coop a bit, but anyway. This is not from the Artists We've Known book, but from the book about Marcel Duchamp's retrospective in 1963 that Walter curated, and it's probably his best-known show. And it's just going to introduce a little clip, a little video clip. So it's a couple of paragraphs. The cagey persona that author Raymond Chandler conceived for his Philip Marlowe detective character was equally apt for profiling the budding museum curator, Walter Hopps, who often engaged in comparable furtive behavior. A dyed-in-the-wool Angelino, Hopps usually wore a dark suit, skinny tie, and thick glasses. At high school age in Los Angeles, when he began prowling B coffee shops and predominantly black jazz clubs, his covert demeanor suggested a poorly disguised undercover narcotics officer. Artist Terry Allen described Hopps' curatorial visits to Chouinard Art Institute, quote, "It was literally like some kind of spy scene. Walter would come in through the back door with his overcoat and the collar up so nobody would recognize him," unquote. Aspiring architect Frank Gehry claimed that at first, honestly, we all thought he was in the CIA. Possessing Philip Marlowe's observational memory skills, Hopps could easily recall any artwork, not only by artist, title, date, and media, but exactly where and when he had first seen it, often with what else it was grouped, on what wall, and in which exhibition. His Ferris Gallery partner, Ed Kienholz, captured these quirks in his assemblage Walter Hopps, 1959, built atop a gas station advertising cutout named the Bardol Man, a trench-coated detective who emerged from the black and white shadows of cartoon commercials.
This story is true. It was 10:37 when he drove in. Light blue sedan, license number B6394. Bad shape. He barely made it. Only one thing to do. I called for Bardol. 10:43, Bardol arrived. He went right to work. Poured 1 quart of Bardol in the crankcase. At 10:45, we had him on the run. Bardol had done it again. At 10:47, Bardol turned to me and said, "New customer?" "Yeah." "He'll be back."
I think we can all see why, when I came up with the idea of doing a book about Walter Hopps and Caroline's collection, that Don had to be the designer for that book. So, yeah, why don't we start with how you all got to know Walter and Caroline, if you can recall back that far.
It's not that far, is it? Well, I first met Walter before he was had moved here, but it was a special dinner for Jim Love that was following an exhibition of his. But Caroline and I got to know each other closely because of her being so involved with diverse works. And I was on the advisory board, and we had lots in common. Plus, we lived in the same neighborhood, so we saw each other often. Our dogs had a great love for each other. But it's great to be here, and I love this idea of our being 3 Houstonians. Rare. Don, you got to know Walter right away from working with him.
I didn't know anything about Walter Hopps when he came to Houston, so I sort of missed a whole early section of art history. But I was working at the Media Center, the Rice Media Center, in the late 70s, and in 1982 is when I first met Walter. And I had been doing, designing the Rice Media Center movie calendar. So I was originally had planned to be an architect, but I started easing into doing graphic design. And when Walter arrived, I had done a few announcements for the Rice Museum, and someone there introduced my name, and so he called me. And I should point out that he always called you. You never initiated a call to him, under any circumstances. He might call you 2 hours before and say, "I'm going to call you in 2 hours." But, there was a very quirky aspect to Walter's approach to talking to people. Anyway, the first show that he worked on was the William Christenberry show called Southern Views that was at the Rice Museum. And
Loved that show. It was great.
it was, of course, a lot of it was Christenberry's photographs and little houses like churches and monuments, but it also included a really controversial piece that Christenberry had been working on for years called the Klan Room. And I thought it was little figurines of Ku Klux Klan members, and it had been sparked by Christenberry's encounter with real Ku Klux Klan members in Alabama. Anyway, it was a very controversial work, and I thought it was really indicative of the kind of edgy things that Walter would do.
He wasn't afraid.
But I was. I think I knew everything about Walter because of my introduction from ceramics. I was so much into clay. I was almost like a psychoceramic personality. But by diving deep in it at Peabody College in Nashville, Tennessee, I came upon conceptual art through the connections with the clay artist that Duchamp knew. And so I was extremely knowledgeable of Walter and his important history. And so by the time I met him, though, I was working at the Rice Museum. I think I was demoted from 6 an hour to 5 an hour I think it was just laziness. I don't know why, but it wasn't Miss D. It wasn't the collision we almost had. It wasn't any of that. It was just my nature. But when I met him, I think I was so intimidated. I was pretending I wasn't, because you have that youthful bravado. And that I think he looked at me and turned around, and that was it. Later on, I was fortunate to try to get my act together, and I had an exhibition at Diverse Works, and which was curated by a dear friend, Caroline. And I remember Walter trying to assist and trying to put this ladder over this ramp. And I saw his energy. He was willing to climb on this most treacherous overhang on this ladder to help hang this tiny work. I think I got a clue that there's nothing to be intimidated by someone who was that passionate about artists. And I kind of speak about this in the article as well. I think that later on, so it's about trust. And I remember my first big exhibition in New York was in this tiny gallery. And Walter came in. And I was worried about the pieces and how to deal with it. I didn't know about the situation. And I said, Walter, I want to keep this thing together. And he said, then don't allow it to ever come apart. If you sell it to the collectors, you'll never see it together again. So I took his advice and became a pariah in the collecting community of New York. I think it was like, back then it was Eugene Schwartz, Marty Margolis. Everybody wanted one of the pieces from the Operation of the Sun to the Cultured Hand, but I said no, and because Walter said so. And, so I don't take it badly. I think I still have that reputation, but Walter allowed it to stay intact so it could come here when I had the show back in '91. So I'm always forever thankful for him causing me to be in economic ruin for about 30 years, but conceptual wealth for as long as I can continue. So.
Well, I think Walter is very hard to disobey when he gives a command, right? It's something you listen to.
He definitely seemed to always enjoy a lot of authority wherever he went.
He does.
Like sort of immediately.
I still feel it.
Yeah, he put out a kind of a force field, and it was projected by his banter. He just talked incessantly, and the stories he was telling, you could barely believe because of the people that were involved and the things he was doing and the kind of edgy, rebellious nature that he was projecting. And he was supposed to be the director of the museum, so it was kind of a dissonance to that.
Because he was anti-establishment, and that was unusual, and still is, for any museum director, I think. And one of the things that was so remarkable about Walter, and he was always for the artists. One of the things I wanted to talk about is how important this place has been to me and to all of us who were here, even in the 70s, starting with Rothko Chapel, when I was in school and still in high school, that opened, and it was put the city on a sort of interesting spotlight for what could be happening in Houston. It was an amazing, and still continues to be an amazing place. I feel very close to it as a person that has sort of validated the effort for art here. And then, of course, once this museum, well, we all went to the Rice Museum, and it was amazing, the exhibitions. But I remember one woman who manned the desk said, you know, sometimes I feel like we put these shows on for 8 people, and you're one of them. But once this place was in the works, I got to come over here quite a bit with my friend Deborah Jensen, now Velders, because she was working so diligently on the conservation lab, and I got to come in and see the building in the works, and it's still one of the places I feel most welcome in the whole city and in the art world. I feel like it embraces artists in a way that very few places I know do.
And Deborah Velders, both Deborah Velders and Neil Prince, who was one of the original curator, he was the original contemporary curator here, both followed Walter from Washington to Houston. Mm-hmm. And it sort of demonstrates the kind of loyalty that he had.
Magnetism.
Yeah, that loyalty, it's a kind of a Texas trait, you know, for better or worse. But I didn't think.
But he's from California.
I know, and yet You remember when Dennis Hopper came and blew himself up on the Speedway?
Oh, of
Does anybody-
course. That was
Yeah,
a
I remember
magical
that.
moment.
See, Walter put him up at my studio afterwards, and
And this is the Gonzo version of Dennis Hopper, too.
yeah, that was that period. I think that when I came, it's like I let Dennis stay, and I came back, and the place was a total wreck. You know, it was like total wreck. And I said, "What happened to Dennis?" And I heard that Walter, his loyalty to his friend, took him away and healed him. Took him away to get help. And I remember seeing Dennis in Venice later and becoming friends with him because there was a connection. And that concept of loyalty, I just want to make clear, is not just Texan. It can even be in D.C. or California or L.A., wherever. It depends on the person, but that's an extraordinary commitment to friends, you know? So.
Yeah, Walter was also responsible for saving Dennis Hopper's negatives. Now he's a very well-known, respected for his photography. And at that point, they were just in jeopardy because Dennis was not being responsible about anything.
I know.
Walter,
I remember they were
Terrible housekeeper.
they were sitting here and Walter took them from, yeah, I don't even know if he asked, but he took them from Dennis, and they were here at the Menil collection for a long time.
I remember that Walter wanted to copy Dennis's T-shirt that said, "Guilty of everything."
It was okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't all it wasn't all easy, I must say. There was a level of, it was a little bit kind of Svengali with Walter. I mean, he kind of dominated whatever was going on, and especially since I basically was working for him, I was an employee, and it just wouldn't fly these days, the things that were going on in his office. Basically, you know, he just talked like a sailor in a mixed company, so that was unusual. Some of his favorite phrases were, "You don't say shit when you have a mouthful," or "You're barreling down bullshit boulevard." When you're trying to explain something, you're completely forbidden from using pronouns in a conversation, so you can't let a he, she, or anything out instead of using the name, because it just confuses the conversation. So,
Yeah, I regret not. I think we're at one of these nice parties in Houston, and Walter started off in that voice about, "I have to tell you, when I was up to my neck in shit." And so, I mean, so that's sort of like what you're talking about,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And I'm sorry I walked away at that moment, because I think you probably know the story. So, no, I really, and his Rolodex. Did you ever see a Rolodex?
oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think he put me on the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. Rolodex.
The phone calls.
Because he would, Caroline, you must have been asleep, but maybe not, but he would call me to talk about things, you know, and it was really, I really felt glad to be awake to receive those calls, because I don't think I ever made a call to him, because he wouldn't accept it, correct? Okay.
Well, I remember taking Walter to lunch quite a few times, partly because I was in the neighborhood and, of course, had time for Walter. He was fascinating. His stories were amazing. But I got to the point where I would begin, knowing I was going to have a luncheon with Walter, that I would start with a question, and I thought about it ahead of time. And one of the last times we went to lunch, I asked him what he thought was going to be dominant in future trends in visual art and in art in general. And he said he thought there would be more and more collaboration, more and more involvement between disciplines, and especially sort of groups of artists who took over and had new things to say together. And I think that's been true.
Yeah, and further about the work situation with Walter. He basically would start working after dinner. And so I was kind of part of a little support team with Susan Davidson, who was the curator here. And we would start working after dinner at night. And they would just go straight through, sometimes till dawn. We'd be sitting in the office over here at 1511 Brannard. He was in the back, and Paul Winkler, the co-director, was on the other side. Luckily, there was a door you could open in the back because Walter was a chain smoker from the day one. Benson and Hedges longs, I remember, because I used to have to go buy them for him. Yeah. And there would be such a cloud of smoke in the office that Susan and I would literally lie on the floor. And this would go on for hours. And somehow this seemed normal. I don't know.
It was. Yeah. I think I smoked back then as well.
I did too.
Yeah. But, you know, I remember quitting in front of the Philip Morris wing of the Whitney. I said they were trying to show me and kill me at the same time. But I think it was a political decision, and that's about Walter as well. There's something, he was not a company man. Mm-hmm. He protected this institution when he saw probable deceit coming down through some kind of corporate level. I really feel that. I mean, it may not be factual. Historians here can correct me. But I felt that he had a sense of political leftiness. It wasn't leftiness. It was just a critical approach to what was going on in the world. And he would exercise that. And I think places like this that are extraordinary, it's because of people like Walter, you know. And I think also my dearly departed friend Jim Harris, in the same way, to have a critical dimension about not just art and to how they both reacted to art in such a profoundly different way. I think that Walter could react to art in this complete historical knowledge that was unnerving. It was so amazing. And how Jim could react to things in this emotional, intellectual level as well. But they both understood the game and what was needed for art to exist and to continue to exist in different times, you know? I kind of felt that.
Walter never got a college degree. He did attend Stanford and UCLA sporadically for a few years, but a lot of the information he gleaned about art history was picked up from books and experience and just looking. I think I've got to tell this story because it's the origin story for Walter, but when he was in high school in 1949, excuse me, he was in a extracurricular class at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Science, and History, and they took a field trip to see the home of Walter and Louise Ahrensberg that was in Hollywood at the time. Mm-hmm. And he always, throughout his life, just said that this completely transformed his vision of what he was going to be, because his parents had expected him to become a doctor because there were 4 generations of doctors in his family. Anyway, when he visited the Ahrensberg collection in their home, which was full of Marcel Duchamp and Brancusi and all the surrealists and Picasso's, it was an amazing collection. That just turned his life around, and that's when he became interested in art and thinking about becoming a curator.
You know, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how one of the reasons we all got to know Walter, the artist in Houston, was through Caroline, because she was working as the co-director or one of the directors, I don't know, with Diverse Works in Houston, and this was vital and really, I think, key to a lifeline to Walter to get to know all of us, because he was here and working under a cloud of smoke, and Caroline would bring him out on the weekends and to various studios, and the Commerce Street studios, which were amazing at the time. And I think Walter did a lot to make it even more welcoming to artists here. And Caroline was invaluable to a lot of interesting experiences here. We did a lot of work together at Diverse Works. I was on the advisory board at the same time Mel was. And I remember one time we had brought in some food on a long meeting that was going to go on for hours, and suddenly it was clear there weren't enough utensils, there weren't any forks, not enough forks. Mel disappeared for 5 minutes and came back. He had made, out of balsa wood, a handful of forks. It was so great. But there's so much interesting work we did together. Caroline and I also curated several shows. One was called Found, and that involved our driving to Austin and San Antonio and looking at different artists. I remember one was Lance Letcher that we picked out. Was that the show where Ardith had her Museum of Rust? That was a wonderful, wonderful group of things that were discovered by artists, and it had a little bit of a feeling of, I thought the installation had a feeling that echoed installations here at Menil. Oh, it was for during the show when Menil opened. So a lot of relationship to assemblage artists that were here at the opening and involved in the, really a kind of influence of surrealism too, I would say.
Diverse Works was a very transformational institution on its own.
It was.
I mean, you have to think back to what it was like in Houston in the late 80s and 90s, and it was a completely different scene. And the Caroline and Michael Peranto and Deborah Godfeld were totally breaking ground. And just like Walter and the Menil collection, they were not only supporting audiences, but they were evangelizing. Not only supporting artists, but they were evangelizing for art audiences. So, people like Mel, wasn't that one of your first shows?
Yes, it was. And my connection to Walter was deeply enhanced by Caroline, because it became like I would always visit my curator in the Heights, and Walter would be incidentally there. And I'd see Jimmy Love, Mr. Love, and see Caroline, and then, of course, get the benefit of both Walter and Caroline. And so it's very meaningful to, after I left Houston, to come back occasionally to see people that were part of your whole makeup, Mm-hmm. And the other factor was also, of course, William Steen had Studio One that really was instrumental in enlarging the conversation that was not had. So Diverse Works, the Menil, and especially...
Can you explain for people who might not know a little bit more about Studio One?
Studio One was really, I believe, the first alternative art space in Houston. And William Steen found a storefront on Congress Street. It was the most... it was a challenging environment, not as enough just to try to show a culture side simultaneously with the shotgun paintings of William Burroughs to house the legendary filmmaker Kurt Krinn. Of course, Walter was very much in touch with William at that time, and it was a space that provided the necessary enlargement of the thought that was available at the time. And I needed a place, so I was lucky to have a studio there and partake and learn so much during that period. So It was
William was the framer here at the Menil collection.
Yes,
also.
and that's so it continued the connection to come here. And after I was finally fired from the Menil, I was never fired. I resigned. Yeah. No, I don't know what happened, but I would always come visit, and was always lucky to see Walter or to talk with William to continue an association that lasted, because William was sort of my dealer as well, and more than art. So it was you get the full spectrum of existence
Yeah.
when you deal with the right characters. And
Well, there was a civic component to both Square One and Diverse Works in the beginning when Diverse Works was on Travis Street, because it was kind of this outpost for arts in the downtown area.
Right.
And Caroline then went on to, along with Tony Beecham and some others, ramrod this restoration of Market Square. And
I wanted to talk about that too.
Yeah.
That was really important. And I think Charles Gallagher, who was one of the first people at Diverse Works, had a vision about Market Square. And it's interesting to me because my great-grandmother erected the cenotaph there, and right after World War I ended. But basically, the project, Tony Beecham and Caroline ran with that and really made it happen, and that was a big side bit of attention and work for you all, and it was a wonderful gift to the city.
Yeah, there's always these other places, like Blaffer Gallery too, with Tony. I met Tony there, and
right.
I remember working there as an art handler or mangler, or however you want to define, and these crates came in of this artist that no one had seen before. It was Frida Kahlo, from a collector, and I was assigned because she wasn't that important to people at that time, it seemed. And I opened these amazing jewels, and I remember applying all my skill to repack them so I could go back to this private collector, and so the straw wouldn't be against the paintings. And so Tony was part of this whole conversation. So I think these smaller institutions were really creating the wave for contemporary art to make Houston one of the most wild-ass places, no zoning places.
And Mel, everything
art.
was so connected then.
Yeah.
There was such a cross-dialogue between all the groups. It was smaller, of course, so
I
easy.
sometimes, not to interrupt you,
No,
I
no.
sometimes wonder if Walter saw in that 1980s Houston moment something like what he experienced in the 1950s in Los Angeles, where there was sort of
I think he did.
it was an ongoing thing with Walter, and it started in California, and then it moved to Washington when he left the Pasadena Art Museum. He was hired as a curator there in 1962, and he left in 66, 67, and went to Washington, and it basically recreated the whole thing of just vitalizing the art scene there, and really working with the community, and really working with diverse people, with what everybody now calls the other. I mean, he was breaking ground in Washington before he came here.
Big supporter of Sam Gilliam
Yeah.
and Caroline's work with the gallery. A lot of artists that crossed over with people you were working with too there. So
And Ann Truitt, and
Right.
of course that's where he met William Christenberry, or maybe earlier, but it's a connection. And then Christenberry introduced him to Ansel Adams.
not Ansel.
No,
William
Walter
Evans.
Evans, excuse me. But yeah, so anyway, there's a legacy of, and that's where Caroline comes in Washington when they meet, and she is working in galleries, and but also participating in this Walter vortex that gets
Being an
going wherever
artist.
he is. And then that all just got transferred over here.
Well, speaking of Washington, Mel, I wonder if you would tell a little bit about the experience you had with the NEA and Walter intervening on your behalf.
Well, it was during a period where after I finished my first museum exhibition at the Hirshhorn, and a voice in my head said, "What do you love the most?" I love making stuff and conceptualizing stuff. And it said, "Stop." So I stopped making art for almost like a year. And Revival Field was the outcome of that, which is a conceptual artwork to use plants to sculpt away environmental toxins. And I believe, I was like, Walter probably heard me, where I became this guy, like the guy in The Graduate that was trying to convince people that the future was in plastics. I was going to art parties telling the future is in plants, and people would say, "Please go back and make your art." So this was this dream, and I applied for this grant for the NEA for $10,000 to have a multidiscipline project. And it went all the way through the regular channels, the jury of peers. It went through the Presidential Council, and then I got a call from a secret call from an NEA staffer. It said there are 47 people that entered this project, and somebody got rejected. And I was thinking, oh, that poor person. I feel so sad. I said, I quit making art for this. I know this, but maybe I'll share some of the money with this person. And then he says, "You." And so the mobilization was intense because there was no recourse. It was the rejection by the chair of the NEA. And you can't go back against that. And I know Karen Finley and the group were the NEA 4, and this was an attempt politically to show the power of the chair just to get rid of problems, authoritarian use. And the struggle was immense. And because, when you put it all together, everything for a project. And I think, and so I started having conversations with Walter explaining the situation, and many museum directors, and a body of artists that were all trying to get me to go meet in front of the chair. And it was achieved. It was achieved when there was finally the guy let up, who the hell is this guy, right? And I remember a call from Walter who had set it up. It was one of those 3 a.m. I don't think I slept for 5 days, and then Walter calls. He hadn't slept either, I'm sure. And he says, "Mel, I got to figure it out. I'm sending these people to speak on your behalf, and we're going to transform things." And I was so fatigued. I said, "Walter, I was so appreciative." And I said, but if I'm not there, we lose, because it's the voice of the artist. And I think he just hung up and got back to me. He said, "You're scheduled." He turned around and created the condition for me to be there and argue on behalf of the project. I don't think I could have made it without him. And that is where he showed his belief in me and the belief in ideas. And he applied all his connections to make this happen, I'm sure. And that piece is now history. It became a reality because of, I think Walter had a strong hand in making that small grant is in principle what needed to be done. And I understood that, he understood it totally. And I owe him a great thanks for Revival Field to come about.
We all do.
Yeah.
Well, would you be up for taking some audience questions?
Sure.
It always takes a second for people to pick up
Right,
their
just
question.
raise your hand. We've got a mic.
No questions? There you go.
Here.
It's been wonderful to hear all of you all talk about Walter and especially Houston and the environment here. And it strikes me, that it's our responsibility to keep that going at the Menil especially, and in honor of Walter, but all the people who have made this city what it is. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about where you find that connection now with your artists, with the young artists working here. Do you feel like this is, how do you make it a place where that continues?
Well, I think one thing is that notion I mentioned earlier that Walter had about collaboration. And I do think there's a huge network of young artists who are working together and know each other. I don't know as many of these people as I would like to. We're a little bit segregated sometimes in terms of meeting each other, but I think it's important. And Liz, you're right. It's vital to keep the dialogue going between the generations and the institutions. I mean, do you have an idea, a good way to do that?
Well, I think that the model that Walter and many people set was to be radicalized and pragmatic at the same time. To understand that we live in a time of incredible polarization, and it behooves the institutions to think about the frame you're within. Like the restrictions that you create are something probably Walter could see and say, this won't fly if you want to make a change. And so it takes not just the people coming out, but to examine the whole frame of what we think art might be, so that the art that we will see in the future is not predicated in the same frame. And I think people like Walter, Jim, many people were instrumental in showing the way. I think that way is bravery. To be brave in the midst of everything that you think the way it should be, and say, well, is there another way? And I think that this place showed that way early with Dominique. It showed when she had the deluxe show in the Fifth Ward where I was born, And I think that keeping up and going beyond that, beyond the idea of exhibition, but having a stand of substance in the face of the very things that we live in now that may destroy everything that we've known. I think we have a chance with now.
I think there's something that this book, the Artists We've Known book, demonstrates really well, and that's something that Walter very much believed in and Caroline believes in, and I know Dominique de Menil was also very much into avoiding hierarchies and putting people in different artists and emerging artists and known artists in different categories, and just trying to look directly at the work. So, and I think we accomplished that with this book because there's some really lesser known people and some really famous people, and they're all thrown together. And the idea, just like with the Menil collection, there's not interference with just direct exposure to the work. And I think maybe there's an aspect of that use your mic.
Give her the mic.
The mic.
It's about, the book talks about this relationships with artists that we had, and it's like when Walter was starting out, Ed Ruscha was just a few years younger. They were starting out together. That's how we have an Ed Ruscha. It was all Mel, Terrell. That's because we knew and admired the work of these artists, and so we were around and spent our time with. So it was really about the relationship with artists.
I'd like to say something about the book, which is, I think it's fascinating as a corollary to the exhibition, but not a catalog for the exhibition. And I think that's sort of a typical example of thinking in a totally unusual way about how to go about things and how to bring ideas forward. And I think it's a beautiful publication. Don, you did a great job. And
Thank you,
I
Don.
think, you know, just so unusual to think in a way about community of artists that make the exhibition and the promised gift. And it's just a really very beautiful book, Claire. You did a great job.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I had this idea as I was researching this amazingly generous gift that Caroline made on behalf of her and Walter's estate. Almost, I think, over 600 objects at the end of the day. And I was reaching out to artists to, you know, find out more about what it was that we were acquiring, and they all would respond with these amazing stories. At the same time, I was reading Hobbes's memoirs, and it was full of stories, and sometimes he would describe an artwork, and I would be like, I think that's the artwork that is, you know, hanging in Caroline's living room. So I wanted to gather some of those stories and have them, you know, saved, and not just sort of floating in the ether for future researchers and people interested, and people, yeah, and anyone who picks it up. So.
Thank you for asking. I thought that was very necessary to convey the story about our relationship and how important he was to that. So thanks for asking.
Well, everyone I asked was so willing, which, I mean, I do think it's, and I'm not an editor, but it's the first experience I've had of authors turning their things in early or like a day later or something like that. Usually you have to poke them a little bit more. Other questions?
Hello. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for your time. You guys talk a lot about Carolyn, but for us that weren't here in the 80s and 90s, I myself am curious, what was her relationship with Walter? Were they married? Were they boyfriend and girlfriend? And also, if there's any interesting tidbit or juicy story between the two, if they happen to, that you feel to share.
It's a great question, Justin. They were girlfriend and boyfriend, and then they were married.
And lots of juicy stories.
I think they were comrades.
Yeah.
They were spies.
Co-conspirators.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And actually, I just read that they had a ceremony in the Philadelphia Art Museum in front of Marcel Duchamp's large glass. They had a couple of different wedding ceremonies, but that was one of them. And I think that kind of tells you something about it's a little bit oddball.
Great question, by the way.
Hello, I'm not from Texas, but I would like to reflect back to you how important the Menil is nationally. And I have worked in museums since 1972, and every museum I have worked in, I have always said, one of the reasons that the Menil is so vital to its community and has been so important is because they're open when people can go. And I have tried to convince every museum director I have worked for, open from 11 to 7. People can come on their lunch hour, they can come afterwards, and this is the most welcoming museum in the United States. It also has great curators, great scholarship, and a respect for the public. And I just want to say, that's how you stay vital.
Yeah.
You always welcome people. And your guards don't have to wear, they don't have to stand on their feet all day. They can sit down. They're human beings, for God's sake. You know, so there's so many aspects of what has been put in place here that every other museum in the United States should do. And I just want to tell you that, you say, how do we stay vital? Because you welcome people, you respect the art, and you give great scholarship. So anyway, just wanted to say that.
There you go. Yeah.
So I think I'll just respond for a minute while we get the next question.
I was just-
Our museum was designed from the ground up by an expert, Walter Hopps, in collaboration with Dominique and Renzo Piana. So,
Yeah, I was just going to say that Dominique always had the idea that the museum would be like her residence. I mean, that was one of the main thoughts behind the way it's presented. And I mean, she even recreated the dark floors and the sort of atriums and
The views onto the garden, yeah.
veranda, there's a
Yeah.
lawn, there's all the things you have.
So that's one of the reasons it feels welcoming. And of course, the genius of Renzo Piano interpreting her ideas.
Yeah, and the vitality is complicit with a belief in human rights. And I think that's what keeps you vital, because not only when you talk about the welcoming of people and considering people human beings, and very usually in this hierarchical structures that we live in, how Dominique's interest and supported it by people like Walter, this drive to maintain that you just cannot have just art without a connection to the future of human beings and how you treat them. So I think that's that's kept it vital and makes me continue to believe that this is a model.
And I think her interest in spirituality and ecumenicism is very unusual and key to some of the presiding spirit of this whole campus. And we're very lucky to have that here in Houston, of all places. With the broken obelisk was originally the de Menils were going to give it to the city to be in front of City Hall, and it was rejected because it was dedicated to Martin Luther King. And so this is a kind of a keystone to a real champion to human rights and civil rights from the very beginning.
I have another question over here. So thank you all for that great chat. I was wondering, what was it like to do a studio visit with Walter? And sort of what was he like in the studio?
Well, he was the main speaker. And then there's this, which means Walter Hopps will be here in 20 minutes. Well, it was really more like 3 hours. So, but he had fabulous insights and was very warm and communicative, and brought in a kind of array of all of art history to address what you're showing him. So it was a big gift to have that knowledge and warm attention on one's work. It was something that was priceless for many of us, especially for me. Same with Caroline, lots of studio visits with her, and a kind of infiltration of knowledge from all of their works and what they've seen and done. So it was a great gift.
I think my studio is too dangerous for anybody to come into, but I'm sure Walter would have come in. But what I was impressed with when he would come see a show, and I've mentioned this before, there are very few people that not only you would wait 3 hours for to come see the exhibition, but someone who would sit in front of a single work for 3 hours to absorb every aspect of it was an extraordinary sight. To see Walter in a chair in front of an artwork and quiet, it's nothing being said. And I felt that a focus, whether drug-induced or whatever means, it still takes a long time, 3 hours. And I think that's what I remember. So the studio visit, I don't know, but in front of exhibitions, I have witnessed his concentration. And I think this desire to embrace what's in a work is a powerful motivation for him. And so.
I have a short story, make it short, but it's kind of concerns Walter's approach to things. When I was very first working with Walter, keep in mind that I was a art major at college, and I was 32 years old, but he called me up. I'd never designed a book before at that point, and he said, I want you to design the Rene Magritte catalog raisonné. Well, my response immediately was, what's a catalog raisonné? And the point is that Walter didn't miss a beat. You know, he just explained to me what a catalog raisonné was. And so I didn't ultimately do it because David Sylvester wanted a British designer. And of course, I didn't have any experience, but I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that Walter inspired faith in yourself. Mm-hmm. And Dominique de Menil did the same thing. They would elevate your aspirations.
Yeah, that's a rare trait amongst curators that can sense a need for that support. And it's not just giving a show. It's about not telling people what to do. It's this kind of sense that you get when you're before someone who has that love of artists, actually, you know. And like I said, I didn't really sense that in Walter personally over the many years, but he did it by action. He didn't have to say it, and he produced that kind of support.
I sensed it personally, but there was a sense of honor, just honoring artists, even when you were a fairly young artist and what you were doing. And he could really, I think, Mel, what you're saying is a super focus on the work that elevates your sense of purpose with what you're doing.
Coolio. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a really nice note to end on, and I will thank our panelists one more time for all those amazing stories that they just heard.
Thank you.
Thank you.